The First Crusade. Act 1. When your neighbor asks you to house sit, and you decide to conquer the entire neighborhood. Our story is set in the Middle Ages, an era when people settled disagreements with swords and spears, instead of angry comments on social media. Europe and the Middle East were like two grumpy neighbors, separated by a religious fence. On one side were the Christian lordships, and on the other the Muslim caliphates. And, of course, their neighborly love was mostly expressed through fiery clashes. On the front lines of the Christian zone was the mighty Byzantine Empire, the steel shield of the East. But times change, and every shield eventually rusts. By the 11th century, a new power emerged, rising faster than a tech startup and threatening to turn this shield into scrap metal. This was the Seljuk Empire of the Turks. Hailing from Central Asia, these skilled nomads rode south, casually converted to Sunni Islam, and began building their own empire with astonishing speed. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Seljuk Turks taught the Byzantine army a lesson they wouldn't forget about bringing a knife to a sword fight. They crushed their opponents and casually repossessed most of Anatolia. Famous Christian cities like Nicaea and Antioch suddenly had to hang up new management signs. Just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, in 1092, the Sultan of the Great Seljuk Empire, Malik Shah, suddenly went on a long business trip, and his empire began to fall apart like a washed-up boy band. The bad news for the Byzantines was that instead of one big enemy, they now faced a chaotic swarm of local Muslim warlords who considered expanding territory and plundering their favorite sport. In 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Comnenus, after reviewing the situation, decided to send a desperate cry for help email to Pope Urban II. The message could be summarized as, "It's a disaster over here. Can you send a few troops to help out?" This wasn't the first time Alexius had asked for aid, but this time, his email landed in the inbox of a man with vision and ambition. "God wills it." Pope Urban II practically slapped his thigh upon reading the plea. He didn't just see a cry for help. He saw a golden opportunity, a chance to kill a whole flock of birds with one stone. Mend brotherly relations. Heal the massive rift between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches from the Great Schism of 1054. Brotherly love would prevail, at least in theory. Assert his authority. Show the lords and bishops of the West who the real boss was. Reclaim the Holy Land. And most importantly, kick the infidels out of Jerusalem, the most sacred of holy sites, which had been under Muslim control for 400 years. It was a massive spiritual real estate deal. At Clermont, France, the Pope held a grand press conference, delivering a sermon so powerful he could have sold ice to Eskimos. He called upon the knights and warriors of Catholicism, men with too much time on their hands and excess energy, to stop fighting each other and point their swords eastward. The Pope also rolled out a promotional package they couldn't refuse. All who undertake this journey with a pure heart, not for greed or worldly glory, but only to liberate the Holy Sepulchre. This journey will count as full penance for all their sins. This was an irresistible offer for European knights, whose rap sheets were as long as a medieval scroll. A chance for adventure and a guaranteed ticket to heaven? Where do I sign up? In their minds, Jerusalem was a city of gold, where milk and honey flowed in the streets. The Pope's call ignited a firestorm of religious fervor. The crowd roared, "Deus Vult! Deus Vult! God wills it!" Their shouts echoed as if they had just won the lottery. This fever spread across Europe. Thousands, from highborn lords to dirt-poor peasants, eagerly signed up for the largest armed pilgrimage tour in
The People's Crusade.
aka the road trip from hell. Pope Urban had envisioned an army of A-list nobles, premium knights, and experienced warriors. But he had underestimated the power of his own marketing. His speech was so successful that thousands of townspeople and peasants decided to jump on the trend. Leading this ragtag mob was a French priest named Peter the Hermit. Along the way, in the Rhineland, some groups from this army, their religious fervor high but their knowledge of geography and ethics at zero, decided to warm up by attacking local Jewish communities. They massacred some 5,000 people and nationalized all their property. The church criticized these actions, but it was like water off a duck's back. In the summer of 1096, the People's Crusade, with the numbers of a Mongol horde but the equipment and discipline of a neighborhood watch, began its march. When they ran out of food in Hungary, instead of asking, they chose a more efficient solution, pillaging the villages of their fellow Catholics. They continued this tradition as they passed through the territory of their ally, the Byzantine Empire. When this God-forsaken army arrived at Constantinople, Emperor Alexius wanted to weep. He quickly shipped them over to Anatolia just to get them out of his hair. And, as expected, in enemy territory, lacking leadership, discipline, and possessing an abundance of cluelessness, they were quickly sent back to the respawn screen, permanently, by the Turks. 2. The Princes Crusade, the upgraded version. While the rough draft was self-destructing, the final version set off. This was the big league. Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, a notorious Norman whose life hobby was harassing the Byzantines, Raymond of Toulouse, and many other big names. They were organized, well-equipped, and most importantly, they had brains. When this formidable army of about 60,000 men assembled at Constantinople, Emperor Alexius had another headache. He had hoped for a small, mercenary force. Instead, he got a massive military festival on his doorstep. He was especially wary of Bohemond, his old nemesis. In the end, Alexius provided them with money and supplies, but on one condition. The leaders had to swear an oath to return any conquered lands to the Byzantine Empire. Everyone solemnly swore, probably with their fingers crossed behind their backs. The Crusaders entered Anatolia. They were powerful, especially the knights clad in armor like tin cans. But they soon discovered that the heat, the terrain, and the hit-and-run tactics of the Turkish cavalry were more annoying than a mother-in-law. Luckily for them, the Muslim world was busy with its own civil wars, as the Turkish lords were preoccupied with fighting each other. No one expected these barbarians from the West to be so serious. The Battle of Dorylaeum was their first major test. Bohemond's vanguard was ambushed. Surrounded by a storm of arrows and elusive Turkish cavalry, Bohemond immediately sent an SOS message to Godfrey's rearguard. For hours they took heavy losses, but stubbornly held their ground. Then, at the most critical moment, Godfrey and his knights appeared like the cavalry in a Western movie, launching a surprise attack on the Turkish flank. Terrified by these human tanks, the Turks broke and fled. This victory opened the door to Anatolia, but soon after, signs of internal division of spoils began to appear. Baldwin of Boulogne and Tancred, driven by personal ambition, split off and headed south. Tancred later rejoined the main army, but Baldwin got lucky and was invited by the Armenians of Edessa to be their ruler. And just like that, the first Crusader state was founded by a guy who got lost. In October 1097, the main army finally reached Antioch, a nearly impregnable fortress. And there, outside its massive walls, they were about to face a true disaster. Act 3. Miracles massacres, and the race to Jerusalem. The siege of Antioch was a nightmare. The walls were too vast to encircle, winter set in, and food ran out. Soldiers and horses starved to death. Morale plummeted, and desertion soared. But just when all hope seemed lost, Bohemond of Taranto proved his talents extended beyond fighting. He negotiated with a tower commander on the city wall. One fateful night, Bohemond and 60 of his men climbed a tower that had been conveniently left accessible. By dawn, the city gates were open, and the Crusaders poured in like a flood, unleashing a bloody massacre. Antioch had fallen, but the celebration was short-lived. A massive Turkish army, led by the powerful Atabeg Kerboga, arrived. Now, the Crusaders, the besiegers, became the besieged inside the very city they had just captured. The situation was worse than before. Emperor Alexius, hearing false rumors that the Crusaders were already defeated, had retreated, abandoning his allies. Inside Antioch, when all seemed truly lost, a miracle occurred. A poor monk claimed to have had a vision revealing the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced the side of Christ on the cross. And miraculously, they dug and found an old spearhead. Whether it was real or not was irrelevant. It reignited the flame of fanaticism in the hearts of the starving soldiers. Infused with an immortal spirit, they decided to sally forth and fight. Though vastly outnumbered, they charged the Muslim army with frenzied courage, fueled by visions of saints fighting alongside them. Kerboga's army, already plagued by internal disputes, panicked and fled. It was an impossible victory. After the triumph, instead of marching straight to Jerusalem, the leaders got busy arguing. Bohemond declared Antioch his own, tearing up his oath to Emperor Alexius. Tensions reached a boiling point. It was only due to pressure from the rank-and-file soldiers that they finally put their differences aside and marched south. On June 7th, 1099, after a long and arduous journey, they finally saw Jerusalem. Many fell to their knees and wept openly, but their joy was quickly replaced by harsh reality. Their army was down to about 12,000 men, not nearly enough to besiege the great city, and they were running out of food again. The surrounding area had been stripped bare. Trees were cut down and wells were poisoned. They had no wood for siege engines. Their first assault failed miserably. But then, luck smiled upon them once more. A few Genoese sailors dismantled their ships and brought the timber to the siege camp. 2 massive siege towers were constructed. On July 15th, 1099, the final assault began. After a fierce battle, Godfrey of Bouillon's forces managed to get their siege tower against the wall. They swarmed into the city. What happened next is one of the darkest chapters in history. In a frenzy of bloodlust and fanaticism, the Crusaders massacred everyone. Soldiers, civilians, Muslims, Jews, men, women, and children. The streets of the Holy City ran with blood. The First Crusade had achieved its goal in the most brutal way imaginable. 4 weeks later, they smashed an Egyptian relief army at the Battle of Ascalon. Their vows fulfilled, most of the Crusaders returned home, carrying with them stories and scars. Only about 300 knights remained to defend Jerusalem under Godfrey, who took the humble title, Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. The man who started it all, Pope Urban II, died 2 weeks after Jerusalem fell, never knowing his project had been such a wild success. The Crusader states were established, fragile and surrounded by enemies. the Muslim world would not remain divided forever. They would soon unite and launch their own holy war. The Holy Land was destined to be a battlefield for nearly 2 more centuries. Many more crusades would be launched, but none would be as spectacularly successful or as brutally horrifying as the first. A story of faith, greed, brutality, and miracles. Or perhaps just unbelievable luck. Thanks for watching.